Hello.
Hi.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to have for this next installment of Forgotten Composers. We have distinguished and esteemed composer David Felder with us today, and he served as my mentor in my PhD studies as well as Shunting and Juan's mentor, and we were just very positively influenced not only by teaching but also the atmosphere he cultivated there, which was just exploding with, I think, creative energy and amazing opportunities. But yeah, I think he doesn't need a lot of introduction. He was the Burge Carey Chair of Composition at SUNY Buffalo, where he achieved the rank of Distinguished Professor. He's really well known for his work with June in Buffalo, which was started by Morton Feldman in the 70s. For about several years, he ran the festival, and then the festival stopped for a couple years, and David was able to revive the festival in the 80s and really made it his own and grew the festival over the following 3+ decades into a world-class festival. He is the founder of the Robert and Carol Morris Center for 21st Century Music and the Slee Sinfonetta. And of course, we are going to want to talk to him about his music as well. He has a very impressive catalog of music and a really distinct voice and a wide range of collaborators, including the Buffalo Philharmonic Orchestra, the Slee Sinfonetta, Signal, Nervat Neo, Magnus Andersson, Irvine Arditi, and the list goes on and on. But it's so good to see you, David.
It's great to see you guys too. I'm extremely thrilled that you're doing this. It's absolutely wonderful. And we haven't seen each other in quite a while. So it's a great treat to see that I'm not the only one getting older.
I know. We were youngins then, and now we're all middle-aged.
It happened.
Yeah. I think it was actually the atmosphere that we had during the seminars at studies. That was kind of the motivator for this podcast, that we kind of missed that type of engagement with other creative, intellectual people, and we kind of got together to start this miniaturized version of it.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. And those seminars were a lot of fun. And it was one of the great achievements that came out of the seminar was that individuals had to confront very different positions in a very collegial way. And there was a wide variety of music. One of the great hallmarks of the Buffalo program when I was there was that we had so many people doing very, very different things. And so everybody was sort of thrown back on trying to find a vocabulary for how they could even begin to communicate about what they were doing, and then finding ways to discuss, ask questions, raise points that could be salient for everybody, no matter what their methodology and aesthetic position might have been. So that was something that I took great pride in being able to foster. And for the most part, we had that.
Yeah, I would agree. We had it definitely the years we were there, for sure. There was such a wide range. We've had a couple other people from the department on. We've had Zane Merritt on and Dan Basson on as well. And yeah, everyone just writes such unique music, but it kind of added to the creative energy.
Yeah, I remember when I was a student, I kind of visualized it like the X-Men school, more or less, because everyone was kind of like a mutant in itself, with its own voice, its own power, its own abilities, let's say. I really appreciated that it wasn't a school in the traditional sense that a style was imposed. It was, in fact, fomented, pushed that you develop your own voice, and everyone went for that. And what yielded was a really individual style, aesthetical style, formal style, and kind of feed off, fed off each other. Uh, but it's a great time for us in our life now. And we kind of missed that, so we kind of set this up and try to stay in touch with the
Your audio is just a little bit funky.
Yeah, it's
Yes.
fading.
Okay.
There,
Oh, that's better.
Yep.
A bit better now? Okay,
Yep.
okay.
Much better.
Now I just wanted to say that kind of missed it, and we set this up, and because we wanted to stay in touch with those kind of roots and ideas that were cemented in the seminar. Pretty
Right.
much.
I think
Eclecticism, universalism, and stuff like that in terms of art.
as composers, we all know writing is hard enough, but talking about the music can be even harder. But the process of trying to explain our music or try to describe others' music is actually crucial for our training because we learn how to turn our mind from like 100 ideas into a more crystalline kind of like thought process, and actually it is also a way to learn how to comment on other music, learn how to be polite but at the same time critical. I think this is a very good training, and yeah, that's the reason why we founded this podcast, so that we have a venue to talk about music, at least for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I think the aspect of challenging oneself to try and frame how you can discuss something which seems, in fact, in some ways, alien to your position. One of the first things that I used to see from people is them struggling first to try to find out what do I have in common with this person who is doing something which is so different than what I'm doing. And then if you can find what you have in common, rather than first focusing on what is different, then it helps clarify what the differences might be. And it changes your approach into being supportive rather than simply being critical. I'll tell you a very brief story. When I first got to Buffalo, um, Marty Feldman asked me to help him with the composer seminar. So the two of us did it together. But that mostly meant that he talked most of the time and I laughed at his jokes. But one of the things that happened a few times was he would play something of his and people would offer questions or comments. And he had very little patience for this. And so there was one time when somebody was offering what I guess he took as a critique. And he said very carefully and with some real edge to his voice, I ain't interested in your opinion. I don't want opinions. I would like to have a discussion. And so, what that really meant was what I was talking about, which is instead of getting into the place where it's I like or I don't like, it's how do we discuss the components of what are in music? What are the aims of the music? What's the intention of the music? What techniques are being used? What is the composer trying to do? Which is very different. It's very different than trying to say I like this piece or I don't like this piece. And that's mostly what happens.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I teach younger students. I teach most of my composition students are like high schoolers, and if I play a piece of music for them, if I ask for a reaction, I get something very vague, like "Oh, I liked it" or "I didn't like it," and either one's acceptable to me. But I'm like, okay, well, why? And no one, that's a very hard question for them. They never know. They never know why. I think they haven't really listened to music critically before.
Well, it's like whether or not one is comfortable with different surroundings. And for young people, it can be very difficult for people to be comfortable in circumstances which are very, very different than what they've been exposed to. So one of the big things is to try to find a way in which you can present something which is in some way safe for them, right? In which some way you can lead them. I once had a teacher. He was an absolutely great teacher. In fact, I learned more from him as an undergraduate than from my composition teacher. And he was a musicologist, but he had studied with Piston. He'd studied composition at Harvard with Piston. And so his approach to he taught listening for people. He taught a basic course called Survey of Musical Style. And he gave a series of handouts in which he guided you in your listening. And he framed listening in a very different way than anybody I'd ever met before. And that was really, really useful for me going forward as I began to confront music that was really different for me.
Yeah. I think that I had a similar experience where I think when I was an undergraduate, I really began to question a lot of the music that was presented at me. But then I really was presented to me by people who I really thought were intelligent people. So instead of just writing this off as, oh, this is the weirdest thing ever, I would listen and listen and listen till I could really decipher what I liked or didn't like about the music. And normally I would find more things I liked about a lot of the stuff. And then obviously I went really, really off the deep end from there. But
I would say that principle that you just exposed kind of like leads one as a composer and an artist to differentiate between good craftsmanship versus what I like and what I resonate with. And I think that at least we've talked before about this, how a piece can be very well crafted, very well made, but it's not of our taste, like in a style that we would like or I will listen to personally. And I think that that's very valuable as a teacher, as a now that I teach humanities, for example, I say to my students that my aim is to teach them how to think, not what to think in specific. Like I don't want to be dogmatic or anything like that. And kind of like that principle of diversity, of styles, of thought, kind of was fostered in. I remember what was that also behind the guest that you brought in when we were at the seminar. I will guess, right? It kind of translated into the people that were senior composers, for example, because I remember we had a lot of different styles over there.
Yeah, I always felt it was very important to create an atmosphere where there wasn't anything that was particularly privileged. So, and what I would say is we find this frequently in the medical profession, but in other professions. In medicine, they call it the white coat syndrome, where a doctor or a nurse comes in a white coat and we suspend our thinking capacity because we think there's an authority. And so one way to antidote that is to present people, a wide variety of people with a lot of different points of view who are clearly expert in what they do, and they present, and then you all have to make some sense of the various positions that they take. I never subscribed at all, as you might imagine, to the idea, for example, Stanford when Brian taught there, in Buffalo when Feldman taught there, all the students did what the master teachers did. And I'm a very deeply suspicious person of what I call cult behavior. And so when I met a lot of Brian's students at Darmstadt and they all had little beards and glasses, I thought, maybe he doesn't really see that they're all even trying to look like him, let alone write like him. So I never wanted that. And I saw what Morty did in Buffalo, and every student had to write like Morty, or he couldn't teach them. And that's completely opposite of my background, my personality.
So it was a school in the traditional sense. It was a school in the traditional sense when Morton Feldman was the head of the department.
Yeah. And oftentimes I think the guests that were brought in also provided another whole viewpoint of music. They were also oftentimes very different than any of the composers already there.
Once Yehudi Weiner, who's an old friend of mine, came in.
Yeah, I remember him.
And Yehudi did a series of master classes for all of the June in Buffalo people. And I saw him coming out of a master class one afternoon at about 4:30. And I said, "How are you doing?" And he basically looked at me and said, "What the hell?" He couldn't really understand what all the students were doing. So, and that's part of the interesting aspect about it, is that there's a wide variety, and I completely understand that response. He didn't have contact with what some of these folks were doing, so he wasn't sure what to say.
Yeah, I think sometimes, I mean, we talk about, obviously we were much younger when we were sitting in these seminars, and oftentimes I think we didn't know how to react to a lot of these guest composers that were coming in. And I think in retrospect, we're like, well, we could have maybe said more than we did, because sometimes I think my reaction sometimes was just to be quiet because I didn't know what to say, or maybe my thoughts were critical and I didn't know how to express that in a respectful way. But yeah, sometimes I look back and I think we say, oh, I wish maybe we would have said more about some of those music and those contexts.
Well, you don't want to be rude in your own house.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
So it's a delicate balance to try to figure out how to frame response. Because I also saw some responses where people piled on to guests. Once the first person sort of broke the ice, then it became this kind of flood. And I can remember a couple of very specific occasions in which guests walked out of there and it looked like they'd been in a prize fight.
Yeah, I remember hearing stories like that when I worked with Aaron Cassidy, who studied at Buffalo. Yeah. From his time there. But I think our time there, everyone was so polite that they were a little bit shy, and we maybe could have had more critical ways of responding, but while still being respectful and promoting conversation.
Yeah, people are there for 4, 5, 6 years maximum, and each group has its own dynamics. And I think I reckoned that I graduated 87 PhDs. So there are various points that I can remember this group and that group and a different group and all of it. And every group had its own dynamics. So the group with Aaron and Evan Johnson and a few other people, that had its own kind of energy and dynamic. So the only thing that I can say is that it's like if you were teaching or coaching a college football team, this group would be X, and then 4 years later you would have a different group, and it's never the same because you're talking about, it ranged from 12 people to 22 people, the size of the seminar. So, different sizes made different dynamics, all those kinds of things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
A quick question: when you like examine like grad school application, when you look at students' portfolio, do you also think about like the overall dynamic of the group when you try to admit new composers?
That's a really great question, and I used to say to people that it's like casting a party or inviting people to come to the party. You don't really want everybody to be all the same, and as you've heard, I very much like people to be very different, and so I thought about that a lot. One of the things that I thought about was the kind of music that people had written, the music that they hoped to write. In other words, I would talk to them about why they wanted to come to Buffalo, what the strengths were of our program. So if somebody said to me, well, I want to write film music and orchestra music, I don't think that's really the right place for that person to go. They're going to be a little bit and frustrated. So yeah, I mean, in a lot of different ways, I look to try to cast the party the best way that I could. And
was it hard?
Pardon me?
Was it hard for you when like students changed direction while they were there? Because I mean, I'm probably an example of it. The music I probably read, even my first year at Buffalo, was probably very different than the music I sent in my portfolio.
Yes, I mean on the surface that's really true.
Yeah,
but I got to know you some as a person, and I was just trying to help you find some things that you were excited about doing that could set you in a place that, as I always said, my hope was that I could help people find a way to continue to compose after they left PhD programs. And so what I was trying to do was help you find a methodology and a technique that you could use to help support the stylistic demands you were interested in.
Yeah.
I mean, if people didn't change at all, I don't think I would have done my job very well.
I think that you did your job very well because of the array of composers that have come out of UV. I think that that's something that you can be proud of, definitely. And I will guess that another thing that was a big part of your life, of your career, was tuning Buffalo, right? Obviously, it's like your name is really attached to that. Would you care to speak a bit about that, about the process, like what you did there, how you chose the composers, the student composers, the senior faculty, all of that, what it meant for you personally?
So it has a little bit of a history because when I first started composing, I could not get a decent performance of the music that I wrote at all, period. And I didn't really get a decent performance of my music until my doctoral dissertation, which I wrote for a clarinet player and the pianist of the LA Philharmonic. And that was the first time any really great musicians really were able to really work on my music and play it extremely well. So I'd always done concerts of younger composers' music, going back to when I was an undergraduate. And when I arrived to teach at Cal State Long Beach, I had an experience of going to the Yale Composers Institute at Norfolk, where they only picked 5 or 6 composers, but we got to work one-on-one with people like Carter and Bruckman and Don Martino, Betsy Jolas, on and on. So, and the group, there were a lot of, the group I was with of 5 or 6 was all very distinguished young composers who went on to have a good career. And we were fortunate in that our music was really well played by great musicians, conducted by one of the better conductors from New York. So when I got back to Long Beach, I formed something called the Young Composers Seminar. And I did that 2 years in California. And it was immediately really successful. And then when Buffalo interviewed me for the job, I said that June in Buffalo had been defunct for 5 years, 6 years. And so I said, well, if I come, I would like to start June in Buffalo again, but in the way that I'm doing it. And so they said, fine, that would be great. I think it was part of the reason that they wanted to hire me. And so the difference between the way I did it and the way Morty did it was that Morty never played the music of young composers. He thought that they should just sit there next to the famous people and listen to what the famous people said, and that was enough. He didn't think that they should get performances.
Yeah.
And I completely disagreed with that because I know that I learned, frankly, more from listening to my music rehearsed and played than I did from any composition teacher. And I had some very, very good composition teachers, so I'm not being critical. But you learn an immense amount immediately confronting the sounds you're trying to make if they're made by people who are really capable of doing them justice and are devoted to it. So that's what I tried to do with June in Buffalo. And I tried to bring in people who would attract younger composers from around the world. And then I tried to bring in the best quality musicians from around the world who would be dedicated to playing young composers' music. Not just playing the senior composers, but if there was a piece by Chun Ting Tang, those people would approach it like they were playing Elliott Carter. And so that was the hallmark of what I tried to do. In terms of the people I brought in, I tried to bring in very diverse people. I determined what I thought was excellent and not. One of the reasons I decided to leave the university is that those kinds of decisions were becoming more and more impossible. There were more and more administrators who only were concerned with how somebody looked or what their gender was. And so there was pressure coming to hire certain people to do certain things. And I always told myself that if anyone interfered with my ability to do what I wanted to do, that I would leave. So I left.
Well, you left with integrity, definitely. It's like something you should be proud of and with a legacy. And oh, we
Yeah.
were talking about that. We talked about that plenty of times, and it's like we try to compare it to other festivals in the US, and it's pretty unique. Union Buffalo is pretty unique, and its legacy is kind of like
Oh
pretty
yeah.
unique in that sense, its eclecticism, in the contacts you made. Probably you wouldn't come into contact with those type of student composers or senior faculty in other places where the style was more uniform, was more homogeneous, let's say.
Yeah.
So there was a bunch of heterogeneity over there that I'm grateful for.
If
I
I,
really,
yeah,
sorry.
sorry, one more thing. If I talk about the importance, something that Megan alluded to, if I talk about the importance of June in Buffalo to the program that I was building in Buffalo. So you come to Buffalo, there are a few very good faculty performers, but there's not a lot. And so if you wanted to have the experience of writing for really great musicians, I had to bring them in. And at first, before I started the center, it was only June in Buffalo. That's the only money that I could raise. So people would work on projects for ensembles that would come in during the summer, and they would have contact with lots of different composers from lots of different places. So it was a great add-on, and even like you could call it year-end project for the graduate students in Buffalo. So it was integral to the whole program that I tried to build. And from there, I was able to finally attract some donors and some funding so that I can open the center and start to bring in groups during the academic year. So during the year, you might have the opportunity to write for 3 groups. And so that would be, in my opinion, better than going to Juilliard or to another program like that, where, yes, you're writing for highly skilled performers, but most of them are students. And I'll probably get in trouble for this, but most student performers would rather be in the practice room practicing the excerpts that they have to play for auditions, and they're a lot less interested in playing Juan's piece.
Yep, especially at a place like Juilliard.
Yeah, so I taught at the Cleveland Institute of Music, and I saw that. And so that's one reason why I created the program the way that I did in Buffalo.
I would like to
Yeah,
say,
I mean,
sorry. Actually, a moment ago, I just want to say that the performances at Dream Buffalo were definitely stellar. And I remember in a reading of my string quartet by Aditi Quartet, I could see markings written by the musicians onto the parts, and which means they actually devoted time to study, to read the music, because in a lot of readings elsewhere, musicians may simply sight read the music that we compose. After graduation, I still participated in quite a number of like festivals or courses, and especially during the time of like pandemic or something like that, when I had to participate like virtually, like online, a lot of performances were, to be honest, were like quite different from what I could imagine in my head when I was working on my piece. But in general, Julian Buffalo in general never disappoints us. Yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were mentioning earlier. It's like we have an idea of how the score will sound. I wanted to mention, to go back to two of the points you made, like, but learning through practice, through relationship, through the with the performers. Uh, that was a luxury, you might say, that we had at the school that we took for granted at the time. It's like right now it's kind of tougher nowadays to have that immediacy with the performers. And well, it's the debate, how would you do you learn better, through theory or through practice? Well, it's like through practice sometimes, and we as composers go into the extreme of being too theoretical, and not being too practical with performers or performances and stuff like that. You learn that the hard way over there. Also, what was the other point? The point of recordings that you mentioned earlier, way earlier. It's like I kind of, at least and well, everyone here, but I really inherited that point of view. I put a lot of emphasis on getting a good recording because, as far as contemporary music goes, we don't get that many performances, and getting a good recording is kind of like uh, fundamental. It would seem nowadays, especially on a streaming age, especially when you get your music out there through the internet mainly. The record, what Stockhausen said at some point, like the work of art being the recording itself, and the score, as I remember you saying at one point, it's just a fiction unless it comes to life. Like, it could be the most beautiful score ever written. If it doesn't get played, if you don't get to work on it on a practical level, then it's just uh, paper that trees basically. So I wanted to point that out. Okay. I wanted to move and talk a bit about your music. Um,
Yes.
how do you how do you think about music? What is your musical aesthetics nowadays? Because as a composer, there's a journey there, a lifelong journey. Like, we've seen it, we've experienced it, but you are much more experienced than us. Can you talk about that?
So it's a really, really big question. So we could talk about that for probably a few hours. So I'll see what I can do to be concise. Um, I loved sound when I was really young, and I had the opportunity to be a singer. So that was how I first started, and I joined the Cleveland Orchestra Chorus during my junior year in high school, and I sat in the front row, the tenor section, and we did all these giant orchestral pieces, right? Like, Mahler, Brahms, all the great orchestral and choral work. And I was right in the front of the tenor section, and right next to me, right in front of me, were the horns and trombones. So I was completely like, my nervous system was completely freaking out by the absolute power in all of that sound. And that was the biggest impetus that got me going, wanting to be a composer. So you begin by trying to imitate what my one-time teacher, Bob Erickson, called the Me Too complex. You want to do what you hear. So you investigate how you can do that. And sooner or later, you come to your own very, very strong ideas that you hear in your inner voice, or at least I always heard those in my inner ear. And so I tried to go about discovering those things over the course of my life. And so I wrote a really big piece that was premiered in 2013 called Le Contretemps Cardinaux, the Four Cardinal Times, which is about a 55-minute mid-sized orchestra, 12 channels of electronics, 2 solo singers, video. It's 55 minutes long. And somebody asked me, well, how long did it take me to write that? And I first had the idea for that piece in a dream when I was in undergraduate in college. But I had no idea how to compose it. I had this object rotating in space, and on each facade of the 12-sided object, there was this different music that I heard. And I just said, well, I've got to figure out and gain the technique I need to be able to write this piece. So in a way, that was you could call it the philosopher's stone that drove me all the way through my composing, was trying to get at the technical ability and skill to be able to get after writing a big piece, which was in some ways related to those big pieces like by Mahler and Brahms and so forth that I sang way back when I was 16. So that's the long arc of it. And in between, there were many, many interesting journeys along the way. And that's the way that I think about it. I mean, I was lucky enough to have some really interesting projects for some great ensembles and musicians. And I tried to explore things that interest to me with the hope that the journey I was taking would interest other people.
Yeah. I was wondering too if you could talk about the way you use instruments and orchestration, because I think you have a really particular voicing. Like you talk about how you were very like impressed with this wall of brass sound. You can definitely hear that coming through. Yeah, and I hear it. I notice it a lot as a brass player myself. And then I think you get this like powerful brass, and then like the strings kind of fill the core. I think I usually don't notice the woodwinds as prominent in a lot of your pieces, and then a lot of use of a lot of times piano, harp, some of the higher mallet percussion. Yeah.
So the question about orchestration really comes down to the image that you're working with, but I think you're quite right. I think rock music recording during the 1970s, there was this concept wall of sound. In other words, there was just like fairly high level, high intensity sound, and that was a kind of mode of behavior. that's something that on some level appealed to me. And so one of the things that I began to work with was how to work with that wall over time so that the wall could have cutouts in it, if you understand what I mean by that. So it's not always like just fully present. And one reason that the last piece that I did, Die Dämmerungen, the last movement is a piece which is there's a huge wall in the second part of the movement, but the whole beginning part of the wall is a little bit of the movement is a little bit like the Concerto for Orchestra from Bartok, in that you have all these subgroups which are bouncing materials around. So there's a lot of ways to sort of hear through the wall in different ways by training the ear to hear things differently. So that's partly what a composer works with when you're writing a piece, is you're actually training people how to listen to your music.
How do you think it relates to the way you use tessitura as well? Because we were listening to especially some of the work you've done in like the last 10 years, and a lot of the tessitura seems to be favored the extremities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good observation. I guess so there would be, the focus would be on the fundamentals, if you want, and the really high upper partials. So most music inhabits the middle ground, really, and the bass is there as a kind of support. But the very upper partials are kind of neglected. They're sort of there as coincidence. And so one of the things I wanted to work on for myself was I wanted to explore the lowest register in particular, because, again, you asked about aesthetics. We're living in very, very dark times. We're at very much at the end of very big cycles are happening right now. You can feel it all around you. So exploring the low register to me seemed perfectly appropriate. But maybe it's possible that we're moving towards something higher, and therefore the higher, more extreme heights, upper partials, would be someplace where we could be going. So those are things that I think about. And so again, the last orchestra piece is very, very much involved with everything starts really low, goes up, comes down. So
I noticed that use of register in your Jude Tarot piece, the High Priestess, it will go like it seems to go like a process from low to mids and then in the highs.
Yeah.
Like it's a really the process is laid bare before the listener who's willing to listen.
Yeah, well, you're right. The process is laid bare, but it's even slightly subtle if you want to get theoretical, because everything moves up based on the C overtone structure. But when it gets to the top, it reverses, and it's the C undertone structure, that's a theoretical construct, undertones. So, but it's the undertone structure which is revealed on the way down. So it's actually turning one structure completely upside down as you go back down, which was fun. I've never done that before.
Shuntin, did you want to add something? You're muted. There you go.
Do you plan, like, do you do a lot of like pre-composition planning when you are working on a project, or are you like very intuitive along the process?
It depends. So sometimes there's a very detailed plan. I'll give you an example. There's this piece I did with Nicholas Isherwood called Shemayim, which is all electronics and voice and video. And that is meticulously plotted out in terms of all the details. It's based on readings of Hebrew letters and Hebrew texts as sacred objects. And those are mapped into what we call vowel space. So everything is extremely articulately planned out as it reflects kind of system like, the Keplerian world music. So that's all very, very detailed and planned out. In a piece like Die Dämmerungen, I just had general guidelines for what we're trying to do. In other words, like rough proportions. Like if you look at, let's talk with the trends, you can see these very 3-2 proportions in some of the very big sections. And I did something similar to that in that piece. But that piece is mostly written by the seat of my pants.
Okay.
Do you approach, we were listening to that piece as well as the Jeu de Taureau 2. And I think there are some similarities in the pieces, but expressed in extremely, extremely different ways. Is it different writing for something like the Sleigh Sinfonetta and Irvin Arditi versus like the Buffalo Philharmonic Orchestra?
Yeah, so I wrote a bunch of pieces for orchestra and a number of them for Buffalo. And it took me a long time to get an idea of what they could and could not do efficiently with the amount of rehearsal time that they would give. So the challenge was, how can I write music which is authentically mine within the constraints economically and artistically of the organization? So the Buffalo Philharmonic is here, and they're very good at the things they can do very well. But then you have something very different when you're talking about Irvin Arditi and a whole bunch of world-class solo who you're working with, like in Jeu de Taureau 2. So I could be very, quote unquote, experimental or the latter. And so in Jeu de Taureau 2, again, the idea of mapping vowel formants had some small part, but a lot of microtones were very, very important in these pieces. And you might get microtones in orchestra music, but they're not the ones that you compose. You get them because things are not quite in tune the way you hope they're going to be. So that's one of the really big differences. And then the whole idea about something which is a very private chamber environment. In other words, you're designing a piece which is going to be played in a small hall with small audiences who are there specifically to be challenged by some more difficult music. And in the orchestral realm, it's a very public kind of thing. So it's like a difference between public art and private art. And there are differences. And so I think it's responsible to approach them differently.
Yeah, I think I was the first one to listen to the new orchestra piece, and my first reaction was that it, especially because I listened to it right after Jeu de Taureau 2, was that it sounded like your music, but it was a much simpler form. The ideas were very direct and easy to follow. Comparatively to the Jeu de Taureau, where we have a lot of similar things, but expressed in a much more complex way with a lot more interplay.
So in Die Dämmerungen, one of the things you realize in writing an orchestra or professional orchestra that's meant to be played on a kind of regular subscription concert is that people are going to hear it one time. That's it. So what are they going to get from hearing it one time, and what are they going to be capable of digesting? First of all, the surface for those folks will be very different. They won't really have encountered anything quite like it, even though it's not so different from some romantic music that they might have heard. One way that I approached that was I made every movement simple binary movements. So every movement divides in two parts. And so there's part A and part B. In one movement, as Juan pointed out, they're kind of mirrors of one another. But in all of them, they go up and then they come down. And so anybody, no matter what their musical background, will be able to hear and grasp some aspect of that, and to be able to relate it to something like twilight, right? The sun goes up, the sun goes down, the color gets brighter, the color gets darker. So those are simple concepts that even complete musical amateurs will be able to grab a hold of. So I'm not speaking down to any audience. I'm trying to reach them where they are, and in a way, fool them into listening.
I mean, what I appreciated that it really did sound like your voice and your music. And so many times, like we've had composers on here or talked about composers' music who we get some of their chamber music and we really enjoy their chamber music. And then their orchestra music is like a totally different person wrote it. It just becomes someone totally new. And I didn't feel that with your orchestra piece at all.
There's a process. I wrote a piece that I'm still very fond of called Six Poems from Neruda's Alturas, which goes way back into the early 1990s. And that's a very successful, somewhat complicated orchestra piece. Buffalo could never really play it because it turns out that two of the three movements, the outside movements, are very hard. And it was too hard for them to do under normal rehearsal circumstances. So in order for me to hear that piece, I had to put together my own orchestra, which I did, which was an unbelievable amount of work to do that. But that's a piece which manages a similar kind of public intention, but that I wasn't yet good enough at recognizing what was realistic and what wasn't realistic, because I thought that, well, those guys can play all that Strauss that they shed in practice rooms all the time, so my parts are not nearly as hard as Strauss. But there was nothing in it for them to practice my parts. Whereas if they practice Strauss, they're gonna learn that for orchestral auditions for jobs. So there's no way they were going to invest that much time to really get my parts really down. So it took me quite a while to learn that. And I had some earlier pieces which were, I would say, from the standpoint of what the orchestra could do, where I was just too optimistic about what the orchestra could do. And that's not that I don't like the pieces, but the orchestra couldn't really do that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, we've talked a lot about the orchestra. I've long dismissed the orchestra as a avenue for my personal work, but both Juan and Shanting have, and Shanting continues to write for the orchestra. Yeah.
One of my teachers and dear friends, who I have his picture up in my studio, so I'm going to look over and say hello. His name was Donald Erb, and he is a very important American composer for a period of time, mostly from the Midwest and from the Heartland. But he was a composer in residence with the St. Louis Symphony for many years. And he wrote 35 orchestra pieces. And after he had retired and I went to see him and we were talking because we were great friends, he said to me, be careful about the orchestra. He said, I wrote 35 pieces. No one ever plays them. And it was a total waste of my time and energy. So I always had that in the back of my head, that one wants to be careful in terms of investment into, I basically, you've heard me talk about beauty contests before, and writing orchestra music is like, Miss USA contest. So you want to be careful about overly investing into something which may not be able to reward you back. Maybe you'll be lucky. Yes. A composer like Stephen Stuckey was very lucky, and a few others. But even now, see, I'm old enough to remember that when I was coming up, I really admired Toru Takemitsu a lot, and I was fortunate enough even to have a lesson with him one time. And everybody was playing his music. And Jacob Druckmann wrote a lot of orchestral music, and people were playing it. And then those composers pass away, and that music's not touched by anybody. So nobody gets into this thinking that, we're going to have this career where 100 years from now, people are going to be playing our music. If you think that, I have some property to sell you in South Florida. But it's not really going to happen. And people who even were really quite famous at the time, Jacob Druckmann was composer in residence with the New York Phil for many years. He ran the composition program. Nobody plays his orchestral music now much at all. And that's just the way of things.
Yeah. I mean, it probably brings more value to the recording.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're spending a year or two writing those pieces, for example, you have to wonder. My piece, the one that I'm most proud of, I call it LQTC, that could potentially be played because it's not a full orchestra. But then I was smart enough to add video and 12 channels of electronics and 2 solo singers. So no one's playing that either.
Would you say that it's kind of like investing in diminishing returns to the orchestra in a way then?
I guess I would say that you should just be very mindful and careful of what it is you're doing. I'm not going to sit here and predict that the orchestra itself as an institution is going to die. I mean, many composers were doing that in the 1970s, but I don't think that's really going to be true, because I think that we have art museums, and there's a lot of old art in art museums. There's not that many modern art museums, though. So asking orchestras to be modern art museums is probably optimistic.
So that's a great comparison, I would say. Following that up, do you think that the orchestra is kind of or has the orchestra always been more or less like a museum institution? Would you say that in a way?
It's more set up to do that, strictly speaking, because of the economics. Because it really depends on subsidies and ticket sales. And even now, in most orchestras around the country, not in Chicago where Megan is, for example, or New York or Philadelphia, Cleveland, but most smaller cities like Buffalo, there are 12 weekends a year where they do their classics concerts. That's all mostly old music. Maybe they can program 1 or 2 new pieces a year, and those are usually commissioned or played because the music director is a champion of those composers, or there's some other compelling reasons why the orchestra might want to do those. But they also have to play contemporary music if they're going to get grants from the federal government or the state. So they do have to do some, otherwise they would do none. So I'm not sure, what the answer is. I know it's interesting to me that most movie scores are orchestras. That interests me because there are many other possibilities. And in the 1950s and 60s, even into the 70s, you would run into music for movies that would be very, very interesting orchestrational ensemble. Yeah. But more like they want, they cost hundreds of millions of dollars sometimes, and they want these big orchestral scores that go with them for some unknown reason. I'm not sure why some movie about some future civilization in science fiction has an orchestra score, but they do.
Definitely. I've noticed that with film, even from Universal Pictures, the classical monsters pictures, those were more adventurous
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
music that nowadays is
Yep.
a curious thing to mention and to study and reflect upon, I would say. Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think though, like I remember the premiere of Le Quattro Tons Cardinaux, and I think that was maybe a good, I don't know, solution to some of it anyway, where you have a really big sound in that piece, but you didn't have to go through the organization of a pre-established orchestra either.
Yeah, I was lucky because part of what I tried to set up was an opportunity for myself to be able to do that work. So, and I was lucky to have some people in the university, certainly not all, and a private donor who was at that point very happy to support the kind of work that I was doing. So I felt freed to be able to write the piece that was my life's ambition. And you're right, it was a piece that was deliberately composed for that group, that hall, those very specific circumstances, which I knew so well.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. I I wanted to mention that I find it really interesting, or rather compelling, I would say, that you dreamt this piece in your youth when you were younger, and it's up until now that you get to write it. And how in now I'm getting into a programmatic aspect of your music, and in you the tarot, you are using the tarot, like that is also kind of like, we might say that you are bringing the unconscious out through your pieces, because the dreams have to do with the unconscious. The unconscious is studied through the dreams, but there are other ways to study the unconscious through tarot, for example. And there's these archetypes there, and how you represent them, sonically speaking. Like you took the descriptions, verbal descriptions and pictorial descriptions, and translated them in a way. I will be careful with that word with translating, but kind of like articulated it in sound. Would you care to elaborate? That intrigues me a bit.
Yeah. So I never talked about this much when you were students, and I never talked about my work very much to my students because I really didn't want to create any kind of subtle pressure for people to try to do what I was doing. And I saw so much of that from other teachers that I wanted to be very careful to stay out of your way. In other words, to not let my bullshit, whatever my bullshit is, affect your bullshit, whatever your bullshit is. It could be completely your bullshit, but not my bullshit. So, what I would say is I've always, ever since I started, the other thing is like what is the purpose of the music that I'm writing? Do I want to just write a good piece? I mean, I don't think that would have carried me very far because then that's like a focus on a gymnast, during some special jump. And once you do it, okay, you did it. So, what is it that sustains us? And so, what is our role as an artist? What are you trying to do? And I'm a very big believer in the higher self, a self that we have to spend our lives trying to access. And then we try to express our journey in trying to understand that higher self. So, yes, there's psychology involved, there's mythology involved, there's the discovery that I made that there are many people working over thousands of years who've been on the same journey that I have been on as a person. And so those people inspire me. So, for example, I discovered when I wrote Shemayim that there was a Jewish mystic who was doing a certain kind of, and he was the first person to ever write about it. And his name was Abraham Abulafia, and he was in Spain. And he was in real trouble for writing about his techniques. which in some ways is related to Buddhist meditation, but it's very, very detailed what he wrote about. And this was a revelation for me. So I decided to write this big piece exploring the world that he laid out in front of people. And that again was around 1270. So discovering that there's someone who lived literally 800 years or so before you did, and who's obsessed with and focused on similar things, that makes me feel really good as a human being. And so that's what I've looked for. I've looked for, you could say, collaborators across space and time.
The tarot itself comes from Egypt, ancient
Yep.
Egypt, let's say 3000 BC or so, and
Yep.
there are these images that are kind of universal that right now, well, the tarot, you can interpret it like the auto-realization of the individual from
Yep.
being a full of potential, kind of like a word salad there, but into like an individual that opens up into the world. Those are the arcana, basically the
Yep.
journey of the individual.
Yep.
And the Jewish the Egyptians understood this, and it's gone on through millennia up until
Yep.
now, and we nowadays we also understand it. So there's a connection, a millennial connection
Yep.
over there. So I think it's pretty intriguing to go back to it.
Well, we're all on the fool's journey, whether we realize it or we don't realize it. And so I had originally hoped to do 21 such pieces, which I'm not going to ever finish.
You
I do
think?
have one. I do have one more that I hope to finish when I finally can restart again. And I want to write just a solo piece for Irvin called "The Hanged Man," which is basically, you could call it crucifixion of the individual self. And so that's how the whole cycle will conclude. I just don't know if I'll ever be able to get to it. I hope I can.
Me too, definitely. I
Yeah.
really like those depictions, those sonic depictions. That answers the question about you the tarot number 3, I guess. Shantin, do you wanted to ask something?
Oh, I just realized you draw inspiration from like a huge, a hugely diverse sources, like from Laruda to Jewish myth, myths, and then and also your titles could be like German or French. Do you mind telling us how do you look for like inspirations for your projects?
The inspiration came about from, you could call it, my tentacular hobbies of following original sources. So, for example, I had a sabbatical in 1991, maybe two. I don't remember exactly. And I decided that I would read the entire collected works of C.J. Jung during that year. And there's, I think, like 22 volumes. But the thing about Jung is that
Are
he
you?
was,
No,
yeah,
no.
Jung. Jung.
J-U-N-G? Okay.
Yeah.
J-U-N-G.
The thing about Jung, the psychologist Jung, is that he
Oh,
studied myth, and so his bibliographies were unbelievably complete. So they provided sources for me to go to, then original sources, and I just kept following them. And so um, usually what my inspiration came out of was what I was studying at that time. So, but they're all tied together because it's all what I said earlier. They're all tied together, but because they're all dedicated to the, you could call it, the evolution of the higher self, the development of the higher self.
Mm-hmm.
the
And
process
so
of
Neruda, for example, is an absolute great writer, myth maker. And where I disagreed with him was He veered off at one point in his life into thinking that communism was his preferred solution to the problems that we have with social organization. And that's very different than the way that I feel. So his work in the 1930s and 40s and even into the 50s did not interest me so much as his early work, and then his very late work when he retreated to the island that he lived in off the coast, and he was basically a nature poet. And his way of expressing things was amazing. And here for me was the key. In all of his poems, there are certain images which recur from poem to poem, and they accrete more and more meaning, almost like in the Bible, when you see different symbols in the Bible have increased meanings as you go through the trajectory of the Bible, so that each symbol, whatever it might be, like for example in Neruda, he loves the symbol of the net. You know what I mean by the net, like a butterfly net. And it starts very early in his earliest poems, and he keeps it through his poetry the entire time. And that reminded me of Mahler, because Mahler does similar things. And so I was presumptuous enough to try to do the same stuff in my own music, that I would carry certain things that I used, certain gestures all the way through, and that they would change based on the context and the intention.
Huh. Um, about the Jung, would you say that the process of individuation as exposed by Jung have influenced you in your music, in how you, or in reading Neruda, for example? Did you read Jung before Neruda?
I think I read Neruda before Jung. Yeah.
Okay.
So I started working with Neruda when I was still in San Diego, and I got to Neruda because I really loved Barrio's music in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And so I studied everything that Barrio wrote, and I read everything that Barrio read as much as I could. And so one of the poets that he was working with was Neruda. So I started reading Neruda and found myself completely captivated.
Hmm. Good to hear that. Because I can see a lot of Jungian thinking if in what you kind of describe about your pieces earlier, especially the Jeu de Tarot, the dreams in Le Quatre Temps Terminó. And I would say that the composer's journey, the artistical journey, goes a lot. It's very, very metaphoric of the human being's journey in a
Yep.
way. It's very kind of like, or the hero's journey, because that's
Yep.
also
Yep.
kind of in all of that. Uh, it's interesting to see that in your music,
Uh,
particularly.
yeah. I started with this process really of studying Jungian stuff. I'm trying to think now exactly what year that was. That would have been before I came to Buffalo. So it would have been 1982 is when
Hmm.
I started studying Jung. I haven't read it now in ages and ages,
Hmm.
but the principle underlying it is still exactly the principle that you're talking about.
Hmm. Thanks for opening up to that. I really had those questions when I was a student, and you were kind of very, very private, and I respect that totally. But it's glad to hear. Um, yeah. Do you want to talk about any of your current works or what you're planning or any current
Um,
projects?
so like I said, what I'm planning now is I hope I can write this extended solo piece for Irvin at one point, the Hanged Man, which will be the concluding piece. It will take no resources except for Irvin. So I hope that those are all the resources I have now. So solo piece would be the way to go. And uh, my piece Jeu de Taureau 2 has never been played. Premiere was canceled during COVID. Then it was supposed to be played during a June in Buffalo um, after as I was in the process of retiring, but it wasn't played then for a variety of reasons. So it has never been performed. It's been recorded. I don't know if it ever will be performed. I have no real idea. My hope would be someday that what I've thought about for the Judith Thoreau projects would be that I imagine that it could be danced with a principal dancer, and then Irvin, the soloist, on the stage, with video and lighting and the ensemble in a pit, and that the whole project, the whole 60 minutes plus whatever the solo piece, could be done as an evening. But again, I have no resources and no way that could ever be, that I could ever make that happen. So I'm hoping to finish off a few recordings. I have some things that have been recorded and mixed in surround, which haven't been released or anything like that. So I'm hoping to slowly but surely work on those. And
Yeah.
I think this will sound a little bit funny to you, maybe, but I think one should know when a good time to stop is.
Huh.
And I completed these very, very big. If you look at my projects over the last 10 years, they're all really, really big projects.
Ambitious.
And I feel they were real capstone and ambitious projects. And so I'm not sure that there's something else that I really am burning to do. I feel like I said in a way what it is that I have to say. And people have heard from me. I mean, if people want to play the music or listen to the music, it's out there. If something changes and I feel like I would like to continue to write, I will change in an instant. But right now, I don't feel that way. I think I had great respect for Debussy, who said when he had stopped composing, he said, "It's disrespectful to tap on an empty head." And I thought that was kind of a wonderful remark and a great way to exit stage left. Mm-hmm. So I don't think my head's empty, but right now I don't have a lot of music floating around in it. And the way that I composed music was that music was always in my head and I always heard everything. So I don't know, some people are very different than that, but I was always rather possessed by what I was working on. So it strangely feels good to not have my consciousness completely filled with whatever project is going at the moment.
Yeah. No, I'm that way with music. I get possessed with all these ideas, but especially, I don't have a lot of resources at my disposal. And I think it ebbs and flows. Like, a year ago, I was working on a solo project with a friend. Solo projects can be really great. And I was really fortunate to work on it. I was really engaged in it. And then I have other times where maybe there's not a lot of opportunities. So I set it aside, and I paint as well. So I have another artistic avenue I can do that's way simpler than composition. But then it comes back. It's not it ebbs and flows, and sometimes it feels mentally healthy for me because it's sometimes hard to be in any space for too long.
I think painting is great. I wish I could paint. I don't have that talent. My son has tremendous artistic. He's an architect, but I don't have that. So, but I will tell you the latest thing that really inspired me was, and I felt the whole inspiration thing swirling around again, was I happened to be in the British Museum in New Haven, Yale, and they had a Turner exhibition. And in the Turner paintings were all these paintings that were done in the last decade of his life. And in particular, there were paintings that were paintings of the very, very stormy, wintry Northumberland seacoast. And there were a few of these paintings that were so friggin' amazing that I was very, very inspired by that. And again, He's a painter
Mhm.
working the last years of his life. It's very dark. The tone of it is very dark. The same thing happened to Mark Rothko. The tone of his paintings became very dark. They were always, you remember from the Albright Knox, right? They were all these very
Mhm.
bright colors, right? But in the
Mhm.
last decade, it was all really dark, purple, dark blues, navies. It's not really linked to Rothko, but that's what he was doing closer toward his exiting the planet. So I think there's something to that as well. Like I said earlier about the low register, the low tessitura. So if you get a chance to look at those Turners from the last decade, I highly recommend them to you.
Yeah, I will.
I really appreciate the honesty on like saying that you don't have anything else to say as a composer, because as what drives us as composers is kind of like discomfort, something that bother us, kind of
Yeah,
like a spiritual or mental pain and a need to compose, to say something in on artistic
Mhm.
terms. And if you don't have that, then you will fall into the same traps over and over, just repeating yourself, being a brand rather than an artist, if you know what I mean.
I do.
So it's kind of like
Mhm.
something to admire, I would say. And I would add to that that it, bringing in June, it will seem like, and you seem pretty serene and tranquil about it. It will seem that you completed that journey of individuation, of realization as a composer, and you are at a very good place in life right now. Like you had artistic fulfillment, and that. Um, Chantin, do you want to add something?
Um, when we look into your works, I could see like a tremendous like transformation from the earlier pieces and to the end. But at the same time, it is also coherent in the sense that your music is always like, I would say, energetic, a lot of
Mhm.
like daring contrast. And so it's, I would say it's like no matter how long the journey is, you are composing to in a way that it is still David uh, in the
Mhm.
long run, and that is pretty remarkable. When I look into my work, actually, I especially when I was way younger, I was like hugely influenced by like a huge variety of like music or arts. And I don't know how I will compose in 10 years or 20 years, but definitely I would like to try to remain chanting in my like future works. Yeah.
Hmm. Well, that one part of that is that I heard my music in my head so much, so that I sort of I wasn't a transcriber of something, but it was very much present in the way that I heard it, and it was very physical for me because I was a singer, so I always tried to keep true to that part of it, and then conducting, I always conducted. I gave that up after shortly after I came to Buffalo because I realized I just couldn't do everything that I was trying to do. So I let that go. But the thing that I think is very interesting and important is that sometimes we each have our limitations, and uh, to quote Clint Eastwood in his movies, a man's got to know his limitations, right? So if you know like what your frame is, what you're working with, without being self-conscious about it, you can work within your frame.
Mhm.
And that's kind of what I tried to do while keeping the inspiration flowing in from outside. I was always asked by people, because when people discover you're a composer, they always say, "Oh, what are you listening to?" And I would say, "I'm not listening to anything. I've got enough trouble with my own work to bring in too much from outside." So really, I
Mhm.
kind of stopped listening to music 30 years ago. I really don't listen to music anymore. And in a way, that kept me focused on what I was hearing in here.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else to add? I will I will ask, like, since, like, what would be some words, like, in a reductionist way, of course, because there's a lot, there will be a lot to say, but what would you advise, be for, or words of wisdom to younger composers that are nowadays trying to make it, so to speak?
Well, it's really difficult because the situation that I came up in, and even when you went to school, you were on the end of something, meaning that composers had found a home in universities, and many of them were universities. But this was never the norm before the period from like the late 1950s, early 1960s, all the way through, let's say, 2010. But the situation changed. The university is a very different animal than it used to be. I don't think there are so many jobs teaching composition. You still might be able to do some teaching of other kinds of things. So, in a way, there's a certain freedom in this because you could feel more free to find some musicians to work with and try to write for those musicians. That's a little bit more pure than being contained within a structure where you have to produce recordings and get your scores published and get reviews in such and such a newspaper, then have a 10-year review file and have a musicologist say, well, we don't really like where he got reviewed, or is he really, really that good, or is she really doing the kind of thing we expect? All of that is completely foreign to a composer who's trying to realize a musical vision. So the advice I would give would be to try to decide what it is you want to do, and then within your means, go about doing it. And try to build your own network as much as you can, and try to find a way within the constraints of that network to express yourself convincingly so that both you and the audience you're working with, whether it's the musicians or a small group, so you can be happy with it. The notion of the big career that we get thrown back at us all the time from the New York Times and the media and people talking about this composer and record companies and blah blah blah. That was never the case. That's a complete fiction. So if you can put all that out of your mind and find a way to create a small little universe for yourself and work within it, you have a chance to be able to be happy as a composer.
Yeah. The difficulty I have with it is that, performers have a lot of these challenges as well. And oftentimes they have to take on whatever pieces that will, pay the bills and feed the bills. So like I've been in situations, because I'm not backed by a university, that there are many performers that I know and I have friendships with that are very interested in my work, but yet have not performed them because they don't have the time and resources often to be able to do it. I've been very fortunate that I've had people who have made a great effort to make it work as well, but yeah.
Well, I understand that completely. The only thing that I would say is, if you look at like what Steve Reich and Philip Glass did, now they've become superstars. I mean, they're the only real superstars we have. And of course, they crossed over into what was pop music, but in a way, they influenced pop music rather than the other way around. But the point that I'm making is that when Steve first started working, it was my understanding from talking to him that he got together with a group of musicians in New York that were interested in playing his music. They all weren't the best players around ever, right? They weren't the best musicians, strictly speaking. They were good for what he was asking them to do. And so they got together and rehearsed in this small music store where they could rehearse after hours. They were given access to the space. And slowly but surely, he began to develop pieces for musicians he was working with. So I think that's a model that we probably all could find some way. My friend Harvey Solberger moved to a small town in Iowa, and he started writing for local music. He was writing for all the best New York groups, right? And then he started writing for small groups in this small town in Iowa where he retired. So, I mean, I think there's ways in which we can all figure out how to approach it if we want to. And I think it's important not to be frustrated, but to continue to be on the hunt for things you can do to keep yourself vitally in and active as an artist.
Find a community.
Yeah.
And that of people that.
Well, it's like, you know, when you think about what happened during COVID, I know that the Buffalo composers in COVID couldn't write for any groups or for anybody, right? So I had them all working on pieces they could perform in their house, or if they had housemates who were musicians, they wrote for little groups of 3 players, for example. And that's what they did for a year, which was pretty horrible, but the alternative was not to compose.
Yeah.
So
one has to find a way. Yeah, definitely. Anything else you guys want to ask?
Today we mentioned the word journeys for quite a bit. And at the end, I would say thanks for being a crucial part in our journeys. Very thankful about that. I still remember in our first lesson, you asked me what I would like to do after the school. I said, oh, maybe I could go to teach at a college, wherever. Oh, so I ended up not teaching at any college. But I'm very fortunate that you make me a little bit more ambitious, more than just like trying to teach a few courses. And you suggested me like applying for like festivals, courses, and those opportunities make me compose harder, or me even compose differently. And thank you for all that. And I am very fortunate that I'm still composing, and I'm still trying to look for a universe for myself. Thank you so much, and thanks for being our guest in this episode. It's a very meaningful reunion.
Well, for me too. Thank you all very much. But I would say for each of you, I can remember very specific kinds of things that happen in lessons and our interactions and all of that. For Chun Ting, I didn't tell you this, but I will never forget your laugh, because you laughed very, very easily. But there was something wonderful about the way you laughed, because you would always listen very, very carefully, and then something would strike you funny. And I really appreciate it. It wasn't just the language, right? It was that you were considering all the aspects of what I said. And when you found it funny, which I often tried to be, I really appreciated that you laughed very genuinely. And I still remember that very, very, very much. I had many students who never laughed at my jokes. So I always appreciated the ones who did. So anyway, it's been really great.
Yeah.
It's been great to be with you, and
It's been really great.
Thanks
I
for
appreciate
Oh yeah,
the
yeah. I really look back. I mean, in the fact that I am able to continue in some way, and I look back on my study, and I consider it like such a huge privilege to even have been able to pursue composition and to be able to do it. It's something that most people in this world don't get a chance to learn. So.
Right.
Yeah.
You're right about that.
Yeah.
So, but it's been great for me to thank you very much for asking me. Very, very few people ask anything of me these days. So it was very nice to be asked. and it's great to chat about music. And I
Good.
really appreciate all your really intelligent questions and the background work you did and all of that. And of course, all the very best to all of you. And if I can ever help out in any way, please don't hesitate to let me know.
Thanks, David.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
for the conversation and for everything you've done for us.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well,
See you. Have a
said-
great week. Have a great weekend.
you too. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye bye.
And bye.